Well, when you've seen a great film, how many of you look forward to seeing the sequel? Sometimes they're disappointing, aren't they? The first one can be great, and the second one, eh. But when it happens and you get a sequel, which is fantastic, it really makes both parts come alive together, the two parts. And in one sense, our readings today are that. The Gospel of Luke, likely written by the physician Luke, a co-worker with the Apostle Paul. And that's the story of Jesus and his ministry. And then we have the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostle, which is part 2, or the sequel. And Luke writes this wonderful book to tell what the Holy Spirit did in the early church. And he writes it with the support, likely, of a patron, a wealthy patron who used his finances to support the copying of the text. And that fellow's name was Theophilus. And so the book is addressed to Theophilus. And so we have this wonderful story in both our readings this morning, focus in on the ascension of Jesus. Now there's another two-part to this, because next week we're celebrating Pentecost, and we have the Pentecost blessing here. So I hope you'll invite friends and family to come and receive laying on of hands and prayer for a refreshing of the Holy Spirit in your heart and ministry. And in one sense, ascension and Pentecost are very much like Acts and the Gospel of Luke. The two go together. So this week, we remember Jesus being called back into God's presence. He ascends into God's presence and leaves the disciples with the challenge. And I want to leave you with these opening words. You're called to be my witnesses. You're called to be my witnesses. If you want, the hands and feet of Jesus is the task given to the disciples this week. Some time ago, in fact, maybe some of you have seen in this past week, remember the torch lighting at the ancient Olympic grounds? It was on television. If you were an early riser, you might have seen it, coming from Greece. And some time ago, I had the privilege to be actually at the base of Mount Olympus and to visit that site. Now, that's the ancient Olympic site is very wonderful for a whole series of reasons. You can walk where Alexander the Great walked. He was one of the competitors in one of the Olympic Games. Another nefarious competitor was Nero, who was a bane to the early Christian community in Paul's time. A great persecutor of the church, actually. And you'll remember him for likely setting the fire of Rome. But when he went, he competed in the chariot races at the Olympic grounds. So as I was walking around this area, I was thinking of Nero walking in the same place. Only Nero had an accident during the chariot racing, and like his personality, he left the games with a lot of anger, but before he left, he robbed the treasury. So he's remembered as a really bad sport and competitor. Now, why did I say this? Because I was thinking of the Olympic site, not just because of the Olympics coming up in London later in July and August, but because one of the games would have been the passing of the baton in the races. And of course, that survived into the modern Olympics. And in one sense, today, ascension is Jesus passing the baton to you and you and you and me and you and you and you. What's Jesus doing? He's saying, I'm going to go back to my Father. I'm giving you the task to be my hands and my feet, carrying the gospel to the world in word and in deed. You are my witnesses. Go forth. But I'm going to send you the Holy Spirit. And that's what we're going to celebrate next week. So you have to come back next week and hear the sermon on Pentecost. But I wanted to reflect for a minute on what the disciples must have been feeling. How many of you have had either been a student who's gone to university or have students who are about to go to university? Is there anybody here? Maybe you've got grandchildren or others. Do you remember the feelings associated with being sent off into residence in another place? My daughter this week is in Quebec City. She's doing a French immersion program. Very interesting. But it was, as she was leaving, in one sense, we gave her the task, you've got to go and do it now. No one else can do it for you, learn French in this case. When you go to a new place, you have to take on the burden of the responsibility of the task, isn't it? And in some senses, going to university for the first time is something of a rite of passage. And both the senders, and if you look at Jesus' words prior to the ascension, all of the advice he gives to his disciples to encourage them, don't worry. I'm giving you an impossible task to change the world, but I'm going to send you the Holy Spirit. And you'll be able to do this. But if you're on the receiving end of that, can you imagine the feelings? To be a follower of Jesus at this time meant to be persecuted and be put to death, as it does, by the way, in many places in the world today. There are more martyrs for the gospel today than there have been in ancient times. You need to remember that. When I go and visit the church in many places, I'm reminded that things can be really tough. And when I visited the church in Vientiane in Laos, they never knew whether the police were going to drop in on them this week and close them down. Can you imagine being a warden of that church? Who wants to be warden? Because you get to be arrested first. Or to be the clergy called to serve in that place. Or how about the church that's underground in North Korea? Or in Saudi Arabia, which is above ground but also underground. And I can go around the world with different places. One of the places that reminded me very poignantly of this was a visit to Goma in Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which I did last year. I went to visit a center for women who had been sexually assaulted. The civil war that's going on there has killed over 5 million people, and it continues to take many, many lives. It's a very complicated civil war. But this center had been set up by the local church as a place for support for women who'd been brutalized and needed support and comfort and healing. And they were the hands and feet of Jesus in such a terrible situation, in a place where people literally lived on the edge, and you didn't know whether you were going to survive to the next day. And there was the gospel. And I could go around the world talking about different ministries that are being carried on by the people of God, carrying Jesus' command to be his witnesses to the world. And so the question for us each is, God's given us the gifts of the Holy Spirit. How does God want me to use these gifts to build the church and to carry forth his gospel? What's my witness like in my family, in the local community where I live, and in the wider community? How do I be the hands and feet of Jesus? This summer, we're very blessed to have 17 people serving overseas, and I hope we'll also see a mission team going to Musanimu's factory. That's still in formation. There'll be 12 people serving with the Diocese of Singapore, and they'll be teaching English to students from Vietnam who are coming to learn English and at the same time are being exposed to the love of Christ given by the volunteers and the local church which hosts this program. We have 5 people in Kenya. 3 are helping to set up libraries. And I got the list of churches this week where a number of those libraries will be set up. One of them is Emmanuel Church in the middle of Corogocho. Cassie knows this well, don't you, Cassie? Now let me describe it to you. Let me tell you the first visit. We were sent there on a Sunday. I asked who would like to go to the Emmanuel Church. It's a bit more remote. You have to walk in. When the driver who was driving them found out where it was, he didn't want to go. He was afraid because it was right in the middle of one of the biggest slums in Africa. And he didn't know whether his vehicle or he was going to get out of there without having been robbed or stripped. And so they were driven in, and you stop at the edge of the road. And I've been to this parish. I had to walk in by myself, actually. And so the road ends, and then you walk through a whole series, a maze of paths for about 20 minutes into the church. What's amazing about this church is they've set it up right in the heart of the slum. It's one of many Anglican projects there. They're running a small infant care program, and we've raised money to help a feeding program for the children. So the children who come there can receive at least one meal a day. We've also, we'll be setting up a library there to help the new elementary school, which is beginning, have some resources. It is one of the most poorest places you can think of. Mud brick church. Most people live in small shacks with plastic that they've just draped over the top. There's no electricity, there's no washrooms. It's a very difficult place to be. But there's the church in the middle of it. And there's the love of God in the middle of it. And there are volunteers from St. Paul's in the middle of it. Or we could talk about the Pickering Cares program and the food bank supported by the community and run by St. Paul's, with over 10,000 pounds of food donated. And what a blessing last week. And I want to say thank you to Marg and to the volunteers for working so hard on that project. With over 6,000 to 7,000 people fed every year, half of them approximately children, happening because of your love and your gifts and your support of volunteer time. The hands and feet of Jesus. You are my witnesses. And in our own time, although we tend to think of our secular culture as being hostile to the gospel, I'm not so convinced. Many of the people I meet are looking for someone to affirm that God exists when so much of the media kind of poo-poos it, and are also willing to affirm that God exists by the way they live their lives, by being people of hope and of love and of caring. And that is what people need to hear in our time. God has touched me. Jesus has touched my life, and I want to share that love with my brothers and sisters and the folks around me. What a witness. You are my witnesses.